The night Brennan died, I stopped breathing properly. Not at once. A man does not notice the moment the air goes thin. He notices it weeks later, when he realizes he has been standing at the same window for an hour watching snow fall on the Eastern Pass and cannot remember deciding to stand there. He notices it when his wolf, which once filled his chest like a second heartbeat, goes somewhere he cannot reach, not gone exactly, but sealed behind something cold and still, the way water seals beneath winter ice. Present, unreachable. My counsel noticed before I did. I saw it in the way Harren cleared his throat before speaking, the way my second, Torval, began spacing his words carefully, as though each one was a stone he was placing on uncertain ground. They had watched me lead 38 wolves through the Carathorn Pass for 7 years without incident, without flinching, without a single loss they had not anticipated and prepared for. Then came the Veldt campaign, and I brought 36 home. Brennan and Cale left on the ridge, my command, my error. I do not ask for sympathy in the telling of this. A king's grief is his own business, and I had lived long enough to know that naming it too loudly only frightens the people who depend on you into pretending they do not see it, which is worse than silence. So I held it inside the way the mountain holds its stones, deep and cold and absolutely still, and I ran the hold as it needed to be run, and I did not speak of the ridge, and I did not go back to that window, and I told myself that the tightness in my chest was the altitude and not anything a name could be put to. The healers my counsel sent were well-meaning, 3 of them over as many months. A trained physicker from the valley lowlands who smelled of dried lavender and tried to give me a tincture for a heaviness of heart. An elder wolf speaker from the eastern dens who sat across from me for an hour and said nothing, which I respected, but whose presence my wolf refused entirely. The moment she stepped into the receiving room, the animal in me curled away from her like smoke from wind, and she saw it, and she left without speaking. A young counselor's daughter who had studied the old texts, and arrived with a leather satchel full of good intentions, and lasted approximately 4 minutes before my wolf's silent rejection, made her apologize her way back through the door. I was not difficult with any of them, I want that understood. I did not raise my voice or dismiss them unkindly. I simply could not be reached, and we all knew it, and there was a certain terrible dignity in the shared understanding of that fact. What I did not know, what no one had seen fit to mention, because she was not remarkable in any way that registered on a council's list of concerns, was the woman in the lower rooms. Carathorn's healers' quarters sit carved into the rock below the Great Hall. 3 rooms, one for storage of medicinal stock, one for treatment of wounded wolves brought down from the passes, one for the healer herself, small and warm and smelling always of pine resin and something sweet I could never name. I had been in those rooms perhaps twice in 7 years of leading this hold. Healing was Counselor Vera's domain. I concerned myself with the battlements and the passes and the rotation of patrols, not with whatever happened to wolves in the rock rooms below. The woman's name was Myra. She had come to Carathorn 3 winters before I lost Brennan and Cale, arrived with a small pack of supplies and a letter of introduction from a healer master in the southern valleys, and been installed in the lower rooms without ceremony. She was not a wolf, not pack-born. A human woman who had spent 12 years learning the treatment of wounded wolves from people who had spent their lives at it, and who had apparently decided that the isolated northern holds were where her particular skills were most needed. She had no rank in my court. She attended no council meals. She came up to the Great Hall for supplies 3 times a week, collected them quietly, thanked whoever was at the stores without making any particular impression on them, and went back down. My wolves liked her. That was the rumor I had absorbed without consciously hearing it, the way you absorb background sound in a room you live in. The wolves she treated came back from her rooms calmer than they had any reason to be. The ones who had been brought in half-mad with pain from a deep wound would be sleeping soundly within the hour. She did not use any herb mixture that Counselor Vera could identify as the cause. She simply worked, and they calmed. My wolf did not react to this information. My wolf, at that stage, was not reacting to much of anything. The incident at the threshold happened in the 6th month after the Veldt campaign. I had come down to the lower corridor for no reason I could have named. Insomnia had become a companion of sorts, and the hold's passages at the small hours of the morning had a quality I found tolerable when sleep would not come, a silence that did not ask anything of me. I was walking the corridor outside the healer's rooms when one of my patrol wolves, a young soldier named Davin, came limping in from the side passage with his arm across the shoulder of a packmate, a deep cut along his forearm from a fall on the iced path above the eastern gate. I would have sent them straight through the healer's door and continued my walk. But Davin looked at me with the particular expression that young wolves get when their king is standing 3 feet away from their embarrassing injury, and he said, "Sir," in the way that means I am about to apologize for existing, and I said, "Go through, it's fine," and moved to step past them. And the door was already open. She had heard them coming. She was standing in the doorway of the treatment room with a clean cloth in her hands and a lamp held low, and the light from behind her turned her outline to gold against the dark stone of the corridor, and my wolf. My wolf went still. Not the frozen, recoiling stillness it had been practicing for 6 months. Not the sealed-ice stillness of a grieving animal holding itself apart from everything. A different stillness entirely. The kind that happens when something moves from very far away through dark water, and the surface above it goes glassy. As though the animal in me had just heard something it had been listening for without knowing it was listening, and had stopped all other movement to hear it better. Myra looked at Davin's arm and said, "Come in, let me see it." Then she looked past him at me briefly with the expression of someone noting a fact rather than a person, the way you clock that it is raining without deciding what to feel about it, and she said, "You can wait in the corridor if you like, Alpha, or you're welcome to come in." Not my Lord Alpha with the downward glance, not the careful distance my people maintained, just a statement, you can or you can. As though the choice were entirely mine, and she had no investment in it either way. I went in. I told myself I was ensuring the welfare of my soldier. Davin sat on the treatment bench, and she cleaned and bound his arm with the quick economy of someone who had done this particular task more times than she could count, talking to him in a low, steady voice about the cut, not deep, no ice infection risk if he kept it dry, come back in 2 days. My wolf, throughout this, maintained its peculiar suspended attention, as though it were standing at the edge of something large and simply watching. She had almost finished when I moved too close to the shelving along the wall in the small room and caught the edge of a wooden bracket with my forearm in the dark. It was nothing, a scrape, a thin line of blood through my sleeve, but she turned from Davin without hesitating and said, "Let me see." "It's nothing." "I can see that," she said, which was not how my people usually responded to me, and held out her hand. I gave her my arm. She pushed the sleeve back and looked at the scrape and cleaned it with the same efficiency she had applied to Davin's wound, and she did not look up at me while she worked, and her hands were very steady, and the moment she touched my wrist, the moment her fingers settled on the inside of my forearm to hold it still, my wolf made a sound inside my chest that I had not heard it make in 6 months. Not a howl, not a surge, a quiet sound. The sound of something settling, the way a stone settles into the right place in a wall. And on the inside of my wrist, beneath her fingers, the mate mark burned to life. I felt it before I saw it, a warmth that moved upward from the point of contact and spread through my arm and into my chest, and I actually breathed fully for the first time in 6 months, the way a man breathes when he has been holding himself underwater and finally allows his body to do what it knows how to do. It was not a gasp. It was the opposite of a gasp. It was slow and complete, and it felt like the beginning of something. Myra had gone still. She was still holding my wrist. She had felt it, I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands had stopped their careful work and simply held, not moving, not retreating. She was looking at the mark, which was a deep branching pattern against my skin, the mate mark of the Carathorn line, which had not appeared on any of my alphas in 3 generations. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at me. Her eyes were steady, not frightened, not performing calm the way people perform calm when they are frightened and trying to conceal it. Simply present, looking at me directly the way she had when she opened the door, the way she looked at everything, without the extra layer of formality that everyone in my hold had learned to maintain around a king who could not be reached. "That's the mate mark," she said. "Yes." "Of the Carathorn line." "Yes." She looked at it for another moment, then she looked up at me again. "Are you all right?" I had not been asked that in 6 months. Not really. The council asked it with their eyes carefully, without actually putting it in words, because naming it might make it worse. My wolf soldiers did not ask it at all because it was not a question you put to your commander. The healers who had come had observed me and consulted with each other and produced tinctures, but none of them had simply stopped and looked me in the face and asked if I was all right. I said not entirely. She nodded once. "Sit down," she said, and pointed at the bench where Davin had been sitting. And Davin, who had been watching all of this with very wide eyes from the corner of the room, took his correctly bound arm and left with admirable discretion, pulling the door quietly behind him. I sat down. She moved to the shelf along the wall and poured water into a plain ceramic cup and brought it back and set it in my hands. And she sat on the low stool across from me, and she said, "You don't have to talk. I'm just going to sit here for a little while." No one had sat quietly with me in 6 months. My council's silences were full of things they were choosing not to say. My wolf soldiers' silences were full of deference and watchfulness. Even my own silences, in my own chambers at the small hours, had been full of Brennan and Kale, and the ridge and the error I could not stop turning in my hands. Her silence was not full of anything. She sat on the stool in the lamplight of the stone room, and she was simply there, the way the mountain was there, not asking anything of me. My wolf settled deeper into that warm, suspended stillness. After a while I said, "I lost 2 men in the Veldt campaign." She said, "I know, I heard." It was my command, my decision. She did not rush to tell me it was not my fault. She did not produce the words people produce for grief, the practiced reassurances that mean well and bounce off the surface of the thing they are trying to reach. She said, "What were their names?" I said, "Brennan and Kale." She said, "Tell me something about them, if you want to." I had not told anyone anything about them, not since the night I brought the pack home. I had written the letters to their families, the formal letters, the ones a commander writes, and I had stood at the Hold's wall on the night of their burning, and I had not spoken, because a king does not speak his grief where his pack can see it buckle him. I told her about Brennan, how he had been the worst singer in the patrol, genuinely, catastrophically bad, in a way that was almost a gift because it made everyone laugh without him needing to do anything else. But how he sang anyway at every fire, loudly and without embarrassment, as though the sound were the point and not the quality. I told her about the way he checked the boots of every young wolf in his unit before a long march, quietly, without making a task of it, because he had come up poorly shot himself, and remembered what blisters did to a soldier's mind by the 3rd day. I told her about Kale, who was serious in the way that some young wolves are serious, not grimly, but with a quality of attention that made you feel seen, and who had been writing a letter to his mother every week without fail for 4 years, always beginning it the same way, always sealing it with the same red thread. I talked for a long time. She listened. She asked twice small questions. What was the march like? Where was the ridge? And the questions were not the kind that were really statements wearing question marks, the kind people ask when they want to steer you toward feeling differently. They were just questions. She wanted to know. At some point I realized the tightness in my chest had shifted. It was still there. It had not disappeared into anything comfortable or resolved. But it was different, the way stone is different from ice. Heavier but solid, something you could put weight on. I looked at the mate mark on my wrist. It was still burning, very softly, the way a coal burns when you stop feeding it wood, not hot enough to be painful, warm enough to know it is there. "You must have questions," I said. "Some," she said. "Go ahead." She thought for a moment. Then she said, "The mark appeared when I touched you. The mate bond, does that mean it was there before and the touch activated it, or does the touch create it?" It was not the question I had expected. I had expected something about what it meant for her specifically, her position, her role, the weight of it. She was asking about the mechanism of the thing. "It was there before," I said. "The bond is present from the time both people exist in the same territory. The touch is the confirmation, the mark is the body acknowledging what the wolf already knows." "So your wolf knew," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" I thought about it. "Since you came to Carathorn," I said. "3 winters ago, my wolf has known since then." I simply was not in a state to hear it. She absorbed this without drama. "And the mark, is it on my wrist too?" "It will be. It appears when the bond is accepted by both. If you refuse the bond, it fades." She looked at her own wrist. I could see the very faint outline of it beginning, the same branching pattern, barely visible like ink pressed on the underside of paper. She turned her arm over and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, I'm not going to refuse it. The directness of it moved through me like the warmth the mark was still producing, unexpected and complete. No performance, no weighing of advantage or disadvantage, just a statement of what was true for her. You should take time to think about it, I said. The bond is significant. There are things it means for your life here. I know what I want, she said, in the same even tone she used for everything, and looked up at me. And my wolf made that settling sound again, deeper this time, the sound of something finding its foundation. I need to be careful here to give you the right picture of what followed, because the story is not a simple thing, and I do not want to clean it into something it was not. I did not become a different man overnight. The grief did not lift the way a stone is lifted cleanly, with a beginning and an end to the effort. Brennan and Cale stayed on the ridge in the way the dead stay, which is everywhere. I still woke at the small hours. I still went to the window. The error still turned in my hands. What changed was this: I was no longer alone with it. Myra came up from the lower rooms the next morning. Not because I summoned her. She came up on her own, with her morning tray of medicinal stock for the upper stores. The same walk she had made 3 times a week for 3 years without anyone in the hall particularly noting it. She set the tray on the store's counter, and she looked at me across the great hall where I was standing with my morning counsel. And she gave me a nod, a single, businesslike nod, the way you nod at a colleague you expect to see later, and continued with her work. My wolf, which had been sealed behind winter ice for 6 months, woke up. Not with a howl, with something quieter and more permanent. The way ice breaks in spring, not explosively, but in a long, settling groan, each piece finding water again. Torval, my second, watched this with the expression of a man who has been standing at a window for 6 months waiting for a specific weather event and is now observing it with private but intense relief. He said nothing. He was too seasoned a wolf for that. But when I dismissed the morning council early and said I would take the stock report later, he arranged his face into something professionally neutral and said, "Of course, Alpha," and moved the others out with a shepherd's efficiency. I crossed the hall. Myra was still at the store's counter, checking items against a list with the focus of someone who had a real system and intended to keep it. She did not look up when I approached, but she said, "The pine resin is running low, and I'll need more of the pressed willow bark before the next patrol cycle." "I'll have Vera see to it," I said. "Thank you." She looked up then, and the steadiness of her eyes was the same as it had been in the lamplight of the treatment room. No excess, no performance, just her looking at me and me being visible to her, which was itself something I had not been in a long time. I said, "Will you walk with me this evening? The east wall at dusk." I stopped, because I had been about to say it's where I usually go, which was true, but also said things about the past 6 months that I was not ready to put into words for the hall to hear. I said, "The view of the pass is clear this time of year." She said, "Yes," with the brevity of someone who had not misunderstood the invitation and was not going to complicate it. We walked the east wall that evening in the cold, the wind coming in long sweeps off the pass, the sky above the peaks going from blue to the particular deep gray that precedes stars. I wore my heavy cloak. She wore a plain wool coat that was practical without being fine, the kind of coat a person buys to work in rather than to be seen in. I showed her where Brennan and Cale had stood. Not that evening, but in the way I explained the campaign to her over time, the geography of it, the decision I had made on the ridge, the thing I had seen too late. She listened without rushing to absolve me, and without agreeing that I had been wrong in a way that was designed to make me feel better about being wrong. She listened the way she did everything, fully, without an agenda beyond the listening itself. "You'll carry it differently over time," she said once. "Not soon, not it will stop hurting, differently." It was exactly the right word. My wolf, for its part, required no time at all. It had known what it wanted from the moment she had stood in that doorway with the lamp held low. Every evening I spent in her presence, it settled further into something that was not contentment exactly. It was a king's wolf, and contentment was not in its nature, but a kind of rightness. The sense of weight distributed correctly, a load that two can carry. The mark on my wrist had fully resolved into the Carathorn pattern within 3 days. The one on hers appeared on the 4th morning. She came up to the hall and showed it to me matter-of-factly, as though presenting evidence of something both had already agreed was true. I held her wrist and looked at it and felt the warmth of the bond running between us like something remembered from before memory, and I understood, standing there in the morning light of the great hall with the pack moving around us, that this was the thing my wolf had been waiting for through 3 winters, not through 6 months of grief, through 3 years. It was not a rescue. She did not ride in and pull me back from an edge. She had simply been there, in the stone rooms below the hall, working, while I stood at windows and held myself still, and the bond had waited with the patience of something that does not need to be urgent because it already knows the outcome. The naming was not a ceremony I planned at length. I had planned ceremonies before, the kind with the full court assembled, the formal recitations, the ritual objects, and the long silences, and the speeches that went on until every wolf in the hall had memorized all of their own feet. I did not want that for her. She would have submitted to it without complaint, because she submitted to most things without complaint. But I knew, from the weeks of walking the east wall and sitting in the treatment room and sharing morning council reports over the stone table in the hold's small anteroom, that she did not need it. She was not a woman who needed the ceremony as proof. What I wanted was simpler. I brought her up to the hall on a clear morning, 17 days after the night at the threshold. The pack was at breakfast, not assembled for anything, just present in the ordinary way, wolves at their tables with their morning plates, the hall warm with the smell of bread and pine smoke. Myra came in beside me with her usual quiet step, and I led her to the center of the hall, and I stopped, and I waited until the hall went naturally quiet around us, which it did quickly, because a king standing still in the center of a hall with someone beside him is a thing that reads immediately. I said, Myra carries the Carathorn mate mark. She is my fated Luna. She leads this hold alongside me with all that means from this morning forward. Those who have questions about this may bring them to me directly. There was no speech beyond that, no recitation. I did not recount her qualities or explain the bond in terms the council had approved. I said what was true and I stopped. The hall was very quiet for a moment. Then Torval, who had been watching the past 17 days with the expression of a man who has had a great deal of relief to privately process, rose from his table and bowed, a full bow, the formal acknowledgement of a Luna deeply meant. The rest of the pack followed, not in the shuffling, uncertain way people follow when they are not sure what they feel but do not want to be last, but in the way a thing is done when it is correct and the room knows it. Myra stood beside me and received it. She did not flinch from it, did not deflect it with modest disclaimers, did not perform gratitude in a way that would have made the pack comfortable with her smallness. She simply stood, with the same steadiness she stood in doorways, in corridors, at stone tables, present, real, undecorated by pretense. She looked at me after, while the hall began to move again around us, and she said in a low voice, "You could have given me more notice. You would have worn the same coat." She considered this. "True," she said. "There is a thing I understand now that I did not understand in the 6 months between the ridge and the threshold, when I was holding myself sealed inside the cold and telling myself this was dignity, this was bearing, this was what a king does with the weight of his errors. A man can breathe or he can hold himself against drowning. He cannot do both at once. The posture of control and the posture of breathing are different postures, and I had confused them for half a year, had taken the tightening of everything against the grief for a kind of strength, when it was actually a different thing entirely. A man under water, very still, expending all his energy in the keeping of stillness. She did not tell me this. She is not the kind of person who explains things to you. She showed me it, the way you show a man something by simply being in the room and being unlike the thing he has confused himself with. That is the other thing no one had told me about the mate bond. I had understood it as recognition, the wolf knows its own, and that is true. But it is also a correction. The wolf finds the thing that allows the man to stop holding himself rigid against his own nature, and then the man can breathe, and the breathing is not a weakness but the condition under which everything else becomes possible. The patrol cycles continued. The hold ran as holds run. I made decisions, good and bad, and held them and learned from them as I had always done. Brennan and Cale did not come back. The error on the ridge did not unmake itself. But the tightness in my chest had become something else. Not emptiness, I want to be precise about this. The grief did not go. Grief does not go. It becomes the shape of something a living person carries, and the shape changes over time, and eventually the weight of it is not the thing that defines every other weight you carry. That is what she meant by differently. I still walk the east wall at dusk. Most evenings she walks it with me. We do not always talk. There are nights when we stand at the place where I can see the line of the Eastern Pass, and I say their names to the wind. Quietly, the way a man might say the names of stars he has fixed his navigation by. Not as a summons and not as a surrender, just as a naming of something real. And she stands beside me, her coat plain and her hands at her sides, and she does not say anything, and I do not need her to. The bond burns on my wrist in the cold. I breathe. I can tell you the exact moment I knew she was going to change everything, though it did not seem like anything at the time. It was 3 weeks before the night at the threshold, which means 2.5 months after the Veldt campaign, which means I was deep in the sealed ice period, moving through the hold in the controlled and unreachable way I had taught myself to move. I was walking the lower corridor, not the corridor outside the healer's rooms, a different one, and I heard, from behind the stone wall that separated the corridor from the treatment room, a sound. One of my wolves, I could not tell which, from the footstep in the next room, had come in with an injury, and she was talking to him in the low, steady voice she used, and I could not make out the words, but the wolf, who had come in breathing sharply and unevenly, I could hear the breath through the stone, slowed. The breath slowed and deepened, and I heard the wolf say something quietly that sounded like thank you, and she said something back, equally quietly, and the exchange was over in a moment, a small, ordinary moment in the life of a stone room below a great hall. My wolf, pressed behind its winter ice, stirred. Just once, just slightly, the way something in deep water moves when a stone is dropped in far above it. I kept walking. I did not understand what I had heard. I did not go to the treatment room that evening or the next or for 3 more weeks. But my wolf had heard her. Through the ice and the stone and the half-year of held breath, it had heard her, and it had moved, and the bond, which had been waiting for 3 full winters with the patience I have described, had felt that movement and understood that we were getting close. The Carathorn hold runs differently now than it did in those 6 months. Not dramatically differently. I am still the same king, with the same standards and the same expectations and the same grief in my hands, which has become, as she said it would, something I carry differently. But the hold is warmer, I think. Not by any decision anyone has made, but by the slow change in temperature that happens when a sealed room is finally allowed to have a window open. She still goes to the lower rooms. She has her treatment room, her wolves, her organized shelves of medicinal stock. She is not interested in the courtly aspects of being Luna, and I do not press them on her. She attends council when it is relevant, which is more often than she expected, because she has the quality some people have of seeing directly through the surface of a problem to the actual problem, and my council has learned to value this, though Torvald took approximately 2 weeks to admit it, and then made up for it by agreeing with her entirely for the following month, which she found quietly amusing. She manages the lower rooms as she always has. She treats the wolves who come in from the passes with the same economy and steadiness, the same low voice, the same unhurried hands. My wolves trust her in a way that was not manufactured by the naming. It was already there, built by 3 winters of her being exactly what she was in those rooms, consistently, without audience. The mark on my wrist is visible at the cuff when I sit at the council table. I do not conceal it. I have had it for long enough now that I have stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a ring you have worn for years. It is simply there, the warmth of it, the weight of it, a fact of my wrist, and therefore a fact of my life. Some mornings she comes up from the lower rooms and she finds me at the window and she does not say anything, just comes and stands beside me, and I feel the warmth of the bond and the warmth of her presence, which are 2 different things that happen to occur in the same location. The grief is where it is. The bond is where it is. She is where she is. And I breathe. I have thought since then about what it is that the bond actually does. The old texts say it is the wolf recognizing its rightful match, the fated mate, the destined partner, the one the moon or destiny or some older mechanism than either of those has selected. I believed this before her in the abstract way a king believes the old texts of his line, with respect and without particular examination. I believe it more precisely now because I have felt it. But what I believe most precisely is this. The bond does not do the work for you. It opens the door, but it does not carry you through it. What it does is create a presence, steady, consistent, undemanding, in which the sealed thing can, eventually, decide of its own accord to come unfrozen. She did not fix me. I want to be clear about this because she would not want the credit for something that simple. What she did was exist in the stone rooms below the Great Hall for 3 winters, treating wounded wolves without fanfare, and then stand in a doorway with a lamp held low at the exact moment my wolf was ready to hear something, and hold my wrist with steady hands, and ask, without any design in the asking, whether I was all right. I think about Brennan still, the boots, the singing. I think about Cale and the red thread and the letters to his mother. I carry them as I carry the mark, present, warm, part of the weight that makes me who I am. I walk the east wall at dusk, and she walks it with me. The bond burns, and I breathe.